Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 36th chapter in the book of Job. This chapter marks the beginning of Elihu's fourth and final speech. He is the final human to speak in the dialogue and the argument in which they are engaged. So Job is a man who's righteous and upright, and then one day suddenly he was prospering, and then everything he had owned and his own children were gone, and he was inflicted with skin sores. So three companions from nearby, I guess Job was in Edomite territory, most of his companions were the same. They mourned and sat in silence and surrender for 7 days. Then Job opens his mouth, and that begins the third chapter, and it takes us all the way to the 37th chapter, where we witness an exchange, the final of which comes from Elihu, who is younger than all the others, and he's not there from the beginning. His speech begins his collection of speeches begins in the 32nd chapter, and what he has to say is in a lot of ways the most interesting of all the comforters, Job included, because the comforters, they spoke technically correct theology by the simplistic standards of their archaic theology. So they had this notion that sin would invite consequences, and anyone who suffered because they sinned. This was aligned very much with the principles of Deuteronomy, for example. But the ways of divinity are exponentially and infinitely more complex than any box we try to fit them in. So they couldn't envision that Yahweh was working through his servant, and that is where Elihu comes along, and I feel makes the most contributing thing, because Job at one point says, "Oh, what wretched comforters I have," but Elihu speaks of suffering as a form of revelation, and whether sought or unsought, everything we've known about ourselves has come from affliction and suffering and not from pleasure or delight. So if you really want to find yourself and find out if you want divinity to speak to you, he speaks to you through your pains, and he can accompany you in your suffering. And sometimes he sends suffering on his servants in order to mold them and refine them through the furnace of affliction. So the opening verse reads, "Then Elihu continued and said, 'Bear with me a little, and let me show you there is still more to say for Eloah.'" So he's kind of dominated the conversation. He took over in the 32nd chapter. The rest are at a stalemate. They can't budge Job, who insists on his innocence, and Job can't convince them that he is suffering unjustly. And but he kind of burst in, and this is his fourth and final speak. So we gather that they may have been tiring of hearing him at this point, but he wanted to assure that this was just he was wrapping it up. He was near the conclusion of what he had to say, and there is still more to say for Eloah. That is the character they're trying to define and describe through Job's turmoils and sufferings. "I bring my knowledge from afar and ascribe righteousness to my Maker." That's a technically correct statement. His knowledge does not come from within himself, but above and from afar. So he's speaking of spiritual, what he thinks is spiritual revelation, and he ascribes righteousness to his Maker. That means that everything he does is righteous and just. Ergo, this suffering he must have visited upon Job was just, because everything he does and everything he is righteous, and he cannot deviate from that fundamental characteristic. "For truly my words are not false. The one perfect in knowledge is with you." So he has an ironclad certainty that he speaks truth. What he has been speaking is truth, and what he's going to say now especially are true. And he assures them of the presence of the omniscient one, the one perfect in knowledge, who is with you. He doesn't say with me, he says with you, the implication being that he is with us in our sufferings, and reveals much about our own character and his own character in the course of our trials. So, "Consider it not evil when ye fall into diverse temptations," we read of in James 1:2, because through the trials and sufferings in the furnace of affliction, we can be molded and refined into more effectual and excellent saints. "See, El is mighty, but rejects no one, mighty in strength of heart." El is mighty. That's an understatement. He's actually an omnipotent being. That's the attribute of infinite or unlimited strength. So he created everything. That was an expression of his bringing it about in motion and holding it all together. He's literally keeping the universe in motion as we speak, and since it came into being. So his strength is inexhaustible. He rejects no one, but people reject him, and the consequences for rejection is that you kind of forfeit your ticket or any avenue of you have that coming to him in the afterlife where it needs him most. And mighty in strength of heart, so he has a heart, he has a will, he has a mind, he's an intelligent being, and heart, he has a strength there, so that's a quality of divinity. He does not keep the wicked alive, but gives justice to the oppressed ones. So this is an overly simplistic statement. Now the wicked flourish and prosper in the world because they are wise in the ways of the world, but they eventually inevitably die. But that is not to say that, the oppressed, the clear evidence in human society is that there is no justice for the oppressed, but Yahweh does sometimes dramatically intervene, and of course at the final day when it's all said and done and history has completed its course, then all the balance of justice will be restored. And so I've heard said the argument for the existence of evil disproves the notion of a loving creator, and I've also heard it compared to criticizing an author after only reading half of the book, because you don't know how the plot's going to unfold unless you wait. So the best things in life are worth waiting for. I have complete and total faith that there is perfect justice in the universe, and it will meet us soon and suddenly and thoroughly and irrevocably. He does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, and kings on the throne, and seats them forever, and they are exalted. So he did not withdraw his eyes from the righteous. Job was in his eyes. He's described as a righteous man in Job 1:1 and 1:8 and 2:3. So he had that character which could be described as righteous. That is something that was alternately used to describe Noah, and not a whole lot of other people in the Old Testament, but Job was one who was clearly righteous, but he had kept him on his eye because he had made him prosper in proportion to his obedience, compelling Satan to offer the insidious argument that take away this hedge from him and he will curse you to your face. So his eyes, Job has no idea why this suffering and retribution came his way. He was not privy to the fact that it basically came from a bet that the adversary offered Yahweh, technically tempting him, but Yahweh indulged. He had supreme confidence that his righteous and innocent servant would not forsake him in tongue or deed. Now, Job didn't suffer because he sinned, but he did sin in his suffering. There are elements of self-righteousness, and a lot of people can interpret Elihu speak, especially in verse 4, when he claims, in other translations it's translated that he speaks with great knowledge, so that's a self-reference and one of self-exaltation. But the kings on the throne, whoever's in charge of a country, is by his sovereign election and grace, and whoever is exalted on the throne owes their position to him, even those who acknowledge him not. And he is capable of working through those who acknowledge him not, such as, for instance, through the Persian emperors who gradually allowed the Jewish people to restore their sacred city of Jerusalem. And Nebuchadnezzar, Pharaoh, there's just on and on the list goes. And if they are bound in shackles, caught in the cord of affliction, then he reveals to them their work and their transgression, that they behave proudly. So the word revealed is what I'm particularly attracted to, because Elihu's concept of suffering as a form of revelation is really profound and powerful and resonating with me, having reread this chapter in a new lens and new light. But, those who are bound in shackles, those who are imprisoned, are in the cords of affliction, those who are suffering, those whose life is not turning out as they would like. He brings that to pass in order to show people what they have done wrong. So that is the nature of the revelation. He does use pain and suffering to goad us and corral us to the easier way, that we think it's the straight and narrow is difficult but simple, and the broad way seems easier, but there's a way that seems right unto man, but the end thereof is death. So broad and wide are the path to destruction, death, and hell. then he that they behaved proudly. So pride, I didn't technically finish the 9th verse. Pride is the original sin. It's what caused Lucifer to fall. And, Job says a few things that could be interpreted as prideful. He boasts of his innocence, his righteousness, his perfect purity at certain points. And, of course, the most insidious and sinful suggestion is that Yahweh was treating him unjustly when he didn't even know why or how or how he was in his present predicament, which was a testimony through all generations since. If they obey and serve, they complete their days in goodness and their years in pleasantness. This is once more an overly simplistic standard that obedience and service and loyalty and love will towards Yahweh will automatically generate physical or material prosperity, and we will have nothing to worry about all our years in pleasantness, having the wealth to live in pleasantness. But there's the material and the spiritual are not parallel forms, we have to understand. But if they do not obey, they perish by the sword and die without knowledge. So the 11th and 12th verse bears a striking resemblance to Deuteronomy 28. Remember, I say a lot of Job's comforter have a technically correct theology by the standards of the archaic one they espoused. So in Deuteronomy 28, we read of the first 15 verses are blessings for obedience. All will be well, you will prosper beyond measure, and you will be safe from your enemies. And then the 15th through 68th verse are the curses which come from forsaking him. And but they're going to perish by the sword. They're going to flee when no one's even chasing them, and they're going to die without knowledge. So they had the knowledge in the covenant, the Jewish people, that is, who I'm likening this principle to, but they died without it because they abandoned it, they forsook it, they gave up on it. But the defiled ones in heart become enraged. Let them not cry for help when he binds them. So Elihu has no pity for those who are defiled through sin. They respond in wrath at the judgment, but he's saying they have no right or reason to cry for help when they are found themselves bound. Their soul dies in youth, and their life among the male prostitutes. So the day we are born is literally the day we become dead, but the day we die in our sins is the day we surrender from sin and never have the born-again experience. So they were marked and conditioned and molded to be evil from their youth. They did not have parental instruction, we imagine, and they, their male prostitutes are associating with kind of sordid people. So that just shows they're not living uprightly. He rescues the afflicted one in his affliction and opens his ears in oppression. Now, not in every way the afflicted would like to be liberated, but he certainly does lift the ones who maintain their righteousness in their suffering to a place of exaltation. And, the ears of the oppression, now there is a power in prayer. For instance, Yahweh was finally moved and compelled to release his people from bondage after 430 years when the groans of his people Israel became loud enough for him to especially notice in the heavens. He says he has heard the groans of my people in their suffering, and they did suffer greatly. The life of a slave is a life of suffering. And he would have brought you out of distress into a broad place where there is no restraint, and what is put on your table would be filled with rich food. So the you and the your is a reference to Job. That's who he's speaking to, remember. I kind of get sidetracked on my tangents, but it is Elihu addressing Job, offering his input on the collective effort to make sense of the suffering. And what he says here is, you could have had a way out. The reason you are suffering and suffer still is because, you didn't respond accordingly or appropriately, or you have some sin. They keep insisting, all four of Job's comforters, who are not really comforters, but companions of sorts, they insist that he has a secret sin that he has not confessed, and that's what's haunting and bringing his devastation and ruin. Little do they know he's going to be restored twofold to what he once possessed and owned. but you are filled with the judgment of the wicked. Judgment and justice take hold of you. So Job's suffering, his travails, his ails, his cries of indignity, and just struggling to make sense of it all is the judgment that he has merited, because judgment takes hold of you. Again, it's you, so he's personally addressing this to Job. And the judgment is the natural and righteous response to wickedness, of which we have no reasonable claim to contest or valid grounds thereto. Because wrath should entice you to scoffing, and do not let a large bribe turn you aside. The wrathful man scoffing is taking trivially what one ought to take seriously, and taking seriously what one ought to take trivially. So scoffers kind of magnify molehills into mountains, and they kind of neglect the serious, weighty, substantive matters of spirituality and eternality in life. And the large bribe, now I don't know why he's saying that, because Job was an honest but prosperous landowner and farmer. Would he value your riches? No, not precious ones, nor all your strength. So Job had riches, but they were gone. He had some 2,000 oxen, X amount, 7,000 sheep, I think, and 10 children who he sacrificed on their behalf, but, they were all gone, and he was covered with skin sores and boils at this point. So Job knows better than anyone else the fleetingness of riches, and he says, what Yahweh has given, Yahweh taketh away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. And in all this he did not sin with his lips. We read at the closing of the 21st verse of the first chapter. Do not long for the night when people go up to their place. Now the longing of the night carries death connotations. And we also read of the same verse, a similar verse in Job 35:10, which reads, no one says, where is Elohim, my maker, who gives songs in the night. So songs in the night, at least in this context, is death. So, and Job had expressed a preferred scenario where he had never been born, but he was never outright suicidal. I don't believe personally that a born-again believer can have a suicidal thought sufficiently to entertain and dwell on, because that is not character. Our heart has been redeemed, and it is aligned with his nature, and it is not consistent with the will of God who has redeemed us to send any of his servants or children to a death premature to what he has intended and purposed. Beware, do not turn to wickedness, for you have chosen this rather than affliction. So he's offering him a warning that from his suffering, don't let it get the best of you. Do not succumb to wickedness. Do not gravitate towards the very wickedness which he impiously imagines had brought about his entire suffering to begin with into being. And so this is the second warning. He says, do not long for death. In other words, you have enough to live for, and while you have life, the one thing the adversary wasn't permitted to take was his life. So while he has life, he has a choice to turn to wickedness or repent to righteousness, and he has chosen this rather than affliction. So in other words, the affliction was a merited response to his conscious, deliberate, and consistent choice to cultivate wickedness. However, secretly in his heart, these people must be imagining, because Job maintains his integrity and his innocence all the way till the end. See, El is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who is a teacher like him? That is a rhetorical question. None can teach him. He can teach us, and everything that a teacher might know originates ontologically from the mind of the omniscient one. So every fact we can process, every truth we can know, owes its origin to him who is the personification of truth. So there's Romans 11, who has been his counselor. That's another rhetorical question. None can counsel him. We cannot presume to advise him on how to run the universe or run his moral order, and that is what Job is doing throughout. And then when he dramatically intervenes beginning in the 38th chapter, his essential argument is, who are you to question me when you don't even know the ways that the sky is stretched out, the earth is spinning, and why you're even alive? You have no epistemological vantage point to question how I bestow affliction and prosperity on my children. Who has appointed him his ways, or who has said, you have worked on righteousness? Once more, he insists on the righteous character, as he does in verse 3 of his Elohim. It's literally impossible for him to act in a manner that's contrary to his righteous nature. Ergo, the suffering he inflicted on Job was for a righteous purpose, and of course it was. It was for a message to posterity. We certainly have the luxury of not being able to envy Job for having gone under it all through our behalfs and for our sakes, but he, not many of us would endure what he endured, even if we were told we would increase twofold in prosperity. Remember to extol his work, of which men have sung. So the words are his works are foundations to the words we lend to him. The work he lends to us is literally everything in motion, everything in the world, everything that is, everything that can be, is a work of his and a gift from him to us. And we often like to return back the favor in what limited ways we can through songs of praise. So all men have seen it. Man looks on it from afar. That's the second time in this chapter we read the word afar, the first being verse 3 when he speaks of bringing his knowledge from afar. So all men have seen it. So this is, all men know. They consciously connect to at least the concept of an almighty, all-knowing, everywhere deity to whom they must answer to at the end of this life. That is ingrained in every human mind, no matter how stubborn the atheist likes to front and pose. They are all as convinced as we are. There are no foxhole atheists, so they can take it to the grave, but it's not going to last them beyond the grave. See, El is great, beyond our understanding, and we do not know the number of his years. So he is great and incomprehensibly so, because that is connected to his eternality. We do not know the numbers of our years. We know our years. Our existence can be dated to a definable moment in time and space, but he created space, so he pre-existent. He is infinite and eternal. We are not, and he's incomprehensible. What we can know of him are rather limited given our finite faculties and capacities, but he does give us enough to know what we need to know, that we might not live without hope, but also he doesn't reveal so much of himself that we could get away with not living by faith, because faith is the righteousness in his moral calculator. For he draws up drops of water, which distill as rain from the midst. So the elements of weather and nature and the natural cycle are in his hand, in his control. It's as nothing to him to make it water, which the cloud drops down, pours down in showers on man. Now, this rain that he sends to fall, he sends on the righteous and unrighteous alike. So he is technically equal in his distribution of the natural resources, although he does ascribe famine and plague as consequences for covenantal violations. That's with Israel, and some other particularly wicked and detestably so nations might experience famine at his sovereign grace because of their wickedness, or it might just be a simple scientific explanation which Yahweh minimally intervened on that sends a drought or a famine anywhere else. But the rain would have been understood as a blessing in the ancient world. They were an agrarian people. Without it, no food could grow. Also, who understands the spreading of clouds, the crashing from his booth? So he actually anticipates much of the argument which comes from Yahweh himself, beginning in the 38th verse. He exposes the limitations of Job's knowledge as to the intricacy of the creative process. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Where were you when I expanded and stretched the heavens? So Job has no answer. He cannot answer this. So the implication being, because you cannot answer this, you are unfit to question or challenge the morality of how I govern what I created. See, he has spread his light upon it, and he has covered the depths of the sea. This takes us back to creation. I believe in the second day, the seas were created, but the seas have mountains and depths in them. So even as we have land, we envision mountains. The sea is also similarly inverse. So there's a lot of water in between these mountains and depths, just to connect it, depths to sea. For by these he judges the people. He gives plenty of food. He has covered his hand with lightning, and commands it to strike. So he sends the rain and the food to all alike, whether righteous or unrighteous, whether wicked, evil, or innocent and upright. But he also, now the lightning is also what he speaks of in the 5th verse of the next chapter. El thunders wondrously with his voice, so it's connected to his voice. And sure enough, in the 38th verse, we read that Yahweh answered Job out of the whirlwind. So he does speak to us in thunder, and thunder is one of the natural calamities he may send when people neglect and reject and don't take his word seriously. He often speaks to us through works, and he often visibly manifests in the presence of lightning. And what are we told? To wait for the sun. His coming will be as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man shall be. Its noise declares concerning him, also the cattle, as to what is coming up. So this actually lays a significant leap to the 38th chapter, because it is what is coming up. They are speaking about Yahweh. They have not been spoken to by Yahweh prior to this occasion, and Yahweh in fact sternly rebukes, if not Elihu, then he does rebuke those outside of Job for speaking of matters too lofty for their understanding, and accuses them of ignorance. But his servant Job, he affirms, has answered him correctly. So even though Elihu is the most interesting and original and mind-expanding theologian of the bunch, nothing good. This is what dialogues are all about. There's no reason we cannot expand the parameters of our own theology by batting ideas from comforters, friends, and people in community, and we can really refine and come to a greater awareness and understanding of divinity by seeking the alternate input of others. And you might not know, you might pick up something from them that's going to dramatically expand your worldview. So that's all the time we have for today. I hope that's the reason you're here, and that's all we have for today. Thank you so much. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.